The moment Confederacy stood 1 hour from death occurred at Gaines's Mill on June 27, 1862, when overwhelming Union force threatened to capture Richmond and to end rebellion. Opens with George McClellan's Army of Potomac being nearly 100,000 strong, massive force representing Union's largest field army, whose size should have guaranteed victory through overwhelming numerical superiority. Positioned on doorstep of Richmond, where Confederate capital was vulnerable to assault that McClellan's army seemed capable of delivering, geographic proximity, making capture appear imminent. If Richmond falls in 1862, examining consequences of capital's loss, Confederacy ends through losing political center and through psychological collapse that would result from capital's capture. The Confederacy ends, meaning rebellion would likely collapse if Richmond fell so early in war, capital's loss being potentially fatal blow to Confederate morale and to international recognition prospects. But on June 27th, when Union breakthrough threatened, tiny Confederate force of barely 3,000 men stands between North's largest army and capital, whose defense required miracle given numerical odds of barely 3,000 representing absurdly small force facing Union corps 7 times larger, numerical disadvantage appearing insurmountable. Men stands as only barrier preventing Union advance that would capture Richmond. Desperate defense being Confederacy's last hope when examining tactical situation's severity. Between North's largest army, whose size and equipment advantages should have overwhelmed any Confederate resistance, Union superiority being obvious to all observers, and capital, whose fall would end rebellion through eliminating Confederate government seat and through demonstrating that Southern independence was impossible when Union could capture political centers, making moment into existential crisis, where 3,000 Confederate soldiers stood between Union Army and Richmond, whose capture would have ended Confederacy in 1862, before major battles that historians remember, making Gaines's Mill into forgotten moment, when rebellion's survival depended on impossible defense against overwhelming odds. McClellan's slow, careful advance toward Richmond reflected Union commander's cautious personality and his overestimation of Confederate strength that made him reluctant to attack aggressively. McClellan surrounds Richmond slowly through deliberate movements that prioritized security over speed, methodical approach reflecting his engineering background and his risk-averse temperament. Slowly meaning advance took weeks rather than days, cautious pace giving Confederates time to prepare defenses that rapid assault might have overwhelmed before they could organize effectively. Believing Confederates are far stronger than they are based on flawed intelligence reports that exaggerated Confederate troop numbers, McClellan's overestimation making him reluctant to exploit numerical advantages. Are stronger, meaning McClellan believed he faced larger Confederate army than actually existed. Misperception, making him cautious when aggressive action would have been appropriate given his actual superiority. Than they are in reality, where Confederate forces defending Richmond were significantly smaller than McClellan estimated. Intelligence failure being critical factor, making Union commander hesitant. Surrounds through positioning army around Richmond's approaches, geographic deployment being methodical rather than aggressive when examining how slowly McClellan moved despite overwhelming advantages. Richmond, whose defenses were actually vulnerable to determined assault, Confederate weaknesses being masked by McClellan's cautious approach that gave defenders time to strengthen positions. Careful advance, reflecting McClellan's personality, emphasizing preparation over boldness. Methodical approach, being militarily sound in principle, but being strategically flawed, when speed could have captured Richmond before Confederate reinforcements arrived or before defenses were completed. Advance that gave Confederates time they desperately needed for organizing defense. McClellan's slowness being critical factor, allowing Lee to plan counter-offensive rather than being forced into immediate retreat from capital whose fall seemed inevitable if McClellan had attacked aggressively instead of surrounding. City carefully, while overestimating Confederate strength through accepting intelligence reports that exaggerated enemy numbers, making Union commanders caution into Confederate advantage when examining how slow advance provided time that would allow Lee to organize defense that saved Richmond. Robert E. Lee takes command and needs miracle, was Confederate leadership change when Joseph Johnston's wounding created opportunity for aggressive general whose bold tactics would transform defensive campaign. Lee replaces Johnston after latter was wounded at Seven Pines, command transition occurring at critical moment when Richmond's defense required decisive leadership that Johnston's cautious approach had not provided, and immediately begins planning audacious attack through recognizing that passive defense would ultimately fail against McClellan's superior numbers, offensive action being necessary for disrupting Union plans. To save city from capture that seemed inevitable if Confederates remained defensive, Lee understanding that bold action was only chance for preserving capital. But first must buy time before Confederate forces could be concentrated for offensive operations, immediate tactical problem being that Union advance threatened breakthrough before Lee could organize counterattack. Buy time meaning delay, Union offensive through defensive operations, temporal advantage being necessary for allowing Lee to assemble forces for planned assault. Needs miracle because military situation appeared hopeless when examining Union numerical advantages and Richmond's vulnerability, Confederate survival requiring extraordinary tactical success. Miracle being realistic assessment of what Confederate defense required, given overwhelming Union strength, Lee's situation, demanding perfect execution and fortunate circumstances. Takes command at moment when Confederacy faced existential crisis, Lee's appointment being critical turning point whose significance would become apparent through his aggressive tactics. Audacious attack that Lee planned, representing radical departure from Johnston's defensive approach. Offensive strategy being risky but being necessary when passive defense would inevitably fail against McClellan's superior army, whose slow advance was gradually tightening noose around Richmond that Confederate forces could not defend, indefinitely through static positions, making Lee's decision to plan counteroffensive into desperate gamble, requiring miracle timing, where defensive forces could hold long enough for offensive preparations while preventing Union breakthrough that would capture Richmond, before Confederate attack could be launched. The Union breakthrough that should have ended war occurred when Union corps crossed Chickahominy River, threatening to split Lee's army and to capture Richmond. A Union corps crosses river through successful operation that positioned large Union force on Richmond's side of water barrier, geographic advantage being tactically decisive for threatening Confederate capital. Crosses Chickahominy River, whose waters divided McClellan's army, successful crossing concentrating Union force that could advance on Richmond while remaining Union troops provided support, and threatens to split Lee's army in two through positioning Union forces where they could attack Confederate flanks, tactical situation creating opportunity for destroying Lee's forces piecemeal. To split meaning divide Confederate army into separated fragments that could be defeated individually, tactical geometry favoring Union forces, whose position between Confederate units made coordinated defense impossible. Lee's army, whose concentration was necessary for effective defense, division being potentially fatal when separated units could not support each other against superior Union forces. In two separate fragments that would be vulnerable to defeat in detail, military disaster appearing imminent when Union breakthrough positioned forces for destroying Confederate resistance systematically. Should have ended war because Union position was so advantageous that Confederate defeat seemed inevitable. Tactical situation appearing to guarantee Union victory that would capture Richmond. Ended through capturing Richmond and through destroying Lee's army. Strategic consequences being war ending when Confederacy could not survive capital's loss combined with military defeat. War, whose outcome appeared decided by Union breakthrough, tactical success, creating strategic opportunity that should have been exploited for achieving decisive victory, ending rebellion through capturing Confederate capital while destroying defending army, making Chickahominy crossing into moment when Union appeared, positioned for war-winning breakthrough that only desperate Confederate defense could prevent through holding against overwhelming odds, until Lee could organize counter-offensive, requiring impossible defensive stand against Union forces, whose numerical superiority and whose tactical position made Confederate survival seem miraculous rather than probable. Only one thin Confederate line stands in their way was desperate defensive situation when tiny Confederate force faced overwhelming Union assault threatening Richmond. A mere 3,000 Confederates under AP. Hill representing absurdly small force for defending against Union Corps, numerical weakness making defensive mission appear suicidal. Under Hill, whose division was positioned to block Union, advanced despite inadequate strength for holding against sustained assault, command responsibility being nearly impossible given force imbalance. Face 21,000 advancing Union soldiers whose numbers were 7 times larger than defending force. Overwhelming superiority making Union victory appear certain. Advancing meaning Union forces were attacking rather than waiting. Offensive pressure requiring Confederate defense to succeed immediately without time for reinforcement or for preparation. Union soldiers whose training and equipment were adequate for overwhelming small Confederate force. Professional quality combining with numerical superiority for creating apparently insurmountable advantages. The ratio is suicidal at 7-to-1 odds, numerical imbalance being so extreme that defensive success seemed impossible when examining how few Confederates faced how many Union attackers. 7-to-1 representing odds that military theory suggested made defense hopeless. Conventional calculations indicating Confederate position was untenable against such overwhelming force. Suicidal meaning defense appeared doomed to fail with catastrophic casualties, odds suggesting that Confederate force would be destroyed without significantly delaying Union advance. One thin line emphasizing Confederate defensive formations' fragility, small numbers preventing depth or reserves that could stabilize breakthroughs, making Confederate position desperately weak when 3,000 men were only barrier between 21,000 Union soldiers and Richmond, whose capture depended on whether impossibly outnumbered Confederate force could hold. Defensive line long enough for Lee's reinforcements to arrive for mounting counterattack, requiring Confederate defenders to achieve military miracle through holding against 7-to-1 odds that conventional military wisdom said were absolutely insurmountable for any defensive position, regardless of terrain or fortification advantages. Hill's men dig in along Boatswain's Swamp was Confederate defensive preparation, exploiting terrain for compensating numerical weakness against overwhelming Union force. They take positions in wooded ravines, whose steep sides and thick vegetation provided natural obstacles slowing Union assault, terrain advantages being essential for making defense possible against 7-to-1 odds. In terrain that channeled Union attacks into narrow approaches where numerical superiority was less effective, geographic constraints forcing Union forces to assault piecemeal rather than overwhelming Confederate lines simultaneously across entire front. Wooded meaning vegetation provided concealment and cover, trees and undergrowth reducing visibility and reducing effectiveness of Union artillery whose line of sight was obstructed. Ravines whose depth created strong defensive positions where Confederate infantry could fire from protected positions while Union attackers were exposed climbing slopes, elevation advantage, multiplying defensive effectiveness. The only terrain that gives them chance of survival against overwhelming odds, geographic features being absolutely necessary for making defense viable when numerical balance made open ground defense suicidal. Gives them chance rather than guaranteeing success, terrain advantages improving odds without eliminating Union superiority, whose numbers remained overwhelming despite geographic obstacles. Chance meaning possibility rather than certainty, Confederate survival requiring perfect defensive execution combined with terrain advantages and with tactical errors by Union commanders, whose coordination would prove imperfect. Dig in through preparing defensive positions, including rifle pits and obstructions, field fortifications, improving positions' strength beyond natural terrain advantages. Along Boatswain's Swamp, whose marshy ground and thick vegetation created natural obstacles supplementing prepared defenses, swamp being inhospitable terrain that favored defenders over attackers, whose movements were slowed and whose formations were disrupted by environmental conditions, making Hill's defensive position into best possible arrangement given desperate circumstances where 3,000 Confederates needed every possible advantage for holding against 21,000 Union attackers whose assault would test whether terrain and determination could overcome overwhelming numerical superiority in desperate defense, whose success was essential for Confederate survival. Wave after wave of Union assaults smash into line with sustained combat when Union forces attacked, repeatedly attempting to overwhelm Confederate defenses through persistence and numerical superiority. For hours, suggesting combat duration measured in extended period, rather than brief engagement, sustained fighting demonstrating both Union determination and Confederate defensive effectiveness. The tiny Confederate force holds defensive position despite repeated Union assaults, resistance being maintained through determination and through terrain advantages that multiplied defensive effectiveness. Holds meaning maintains position without being overrun. Confederate success being measured by preventing Union breakthrough rather than by inflicting prohibitive casualties. Taking horrific casualties as Confederate defenders suffered severe losses from Union fire and from repeated assaults, attrition being inevitable when small force faced sustained attacks by overwhelming numbers, horrific emphasizing severity of losses, casualty rates being unsustainable if combat continued indefinitely, making Confederate defensive success temporary achievement, requiring reinforcement. But refusing to break psychologically despite casualties, and despite being outnumbered 7-1, Confederate morale remaining intact when examining how defenders maintained positions rather than retreating or surrendering. To break meaning collapse of defensive will, Confederate psychological resilience being as important as tactical competence when examining why defense succeeded despite overwhelming odds. Wave after wave, emphasizing repetitive nature of Union assaults, multiple attacks, demonstrating Union commanders' determination to break through despite initial failures. Smash suggesting violent impact, Union attacks being forceful attempts to overwhelm defense through concentrated force rather than through careful maneuvering, making combat into attritional struggle where Confederate defenders absorbed repeated assaults while maintaining defensive positions through combination of terrain advantages, fortification preparations, and desperate determination to prevent Union breakthrough that would doom Richmond, requiring Confederate soldiers to endure hours of combat against overwhelming odds while suffering horrific casualties that would have broken less determined defenders, but that Hill's men absorbed while refusing to retreat from. Positions whose loss would mean Confederate capital's capture and rebellion's end. Lee's reinforcements are lost, delayed, or miscommunicating. Was coordination failure when Confederate counterattack plan collapsed through organizational problems, preventing timely execution. What should have been coordinated Confederate attack representing Lee's plan for relieving pressure on Hill's defenders through launching offensive that would strike Union forces from multiple directions simultaneously. Becomes chaos through failures in communication, navigation, and timing that prevented coordinated execution. Confederate columns becoming separated and attacking piecemeal rather than simultaneously. Chaos, meaning complete breakdown of coordinated operations, Lee's careful planning being undermined by execution failures that left Hill's force fighting alone longer than intended. The 3,000 men have to hold far longer than Lee planned because reinforcements delays meant Hill's defenders remained isolated against overwhelming Union force, extended defensive mission exceeding what Lee had intended when designing operational timeline. Have to meaning necessity rather than choice, Hill's men being forced to continue impossible defense because alternative was Union breakthrough. Far longer, emphasizing unexpected duration, defensive mission lasting hours beyond what Lee's plan had anticipated when coordination failures delayed relieving forces. Than Lee planned when designing operation, whose timing assumed reinforcements would arrive quickly for launching counterattack that would relieve Hill's embattled defenders, actual delays forcing desperate defense to continue. Lost meaning some Confederate units could not find correct routes to battlefield, navigation failures preventing them from reaching combat in time for supporting Hill's defense. Delayed through various factors, including difficult terrain and organizational confusion, temporal failures making coordinated attack impossible when units arrived sequentially rather than simultaneously, or miscommunicating when orders were unclear or when communications broke down preventing coordination, Information failures, compounding navigation and timing problems, for creating complete organizational breakdown that left Hill's 3,000 men fighting alone for hours, beyond planned duration, while suffering horrific casualties. That were supposed to be brief holding action before Lee's counterattack relieved pressure through attacking Union flanks, making coordination failures into crisis that forced tiny Confederate force to achieve military miracle through holding defensive line without support. The line begins to collapse was crisis moment when Confederate defenses started failing under sustained Union pressure after hours of combat had exhausted defenders. Union troops finally break through sections of swamp line after repeated assaults, eventually succeeded in penetrating Confederate defenses at weak points, breakthrough creating immediate danger of complete collapse. Finally suggesting long struggle, Union success coming after extended combat, where multiple previous assaults had failed against determined Confederate resistance. Breakthrough meaning, penetrate defensive positions. Union soldiers advancing past Confederate line in sectors where defenses had been weakened by casualties or by exhaustion. Sections of defensive perimeter rather than entire line, localized breakthroughs threatening to expand into complete collapse if Confederate commanders could not seal gaps. Confederate defenders fall back in exhaustion after hours of combat without relief, physical and psychological fatigue, making continued resistance nearly impossible when examining soldiers' condition. Fallback meaning retreat from forward positions, withdrawal being tactical necessity when positions became untenable rather than being panic flight. In exhaustion from sustained combat and from casualties that reduced defensive effectiveness, Confederate fatigue being critical factor, making continued defense doubtful. The moment of collapse is seconds away when examining how close Confederate defense came to complete failure, temporal proximity to disaster emphasizing how desperate situation had become. Seconds away, suggesting immediate rather than eventual, Confederate defensive integrity being on verge of catastrophic failure that would allow Union breakthrough to Richmond, is seconds from catastrophic failure when local breakthroughs threatened to cascade into general collapse, Confederate line being maintained through sheer determination despite tactical situations suggesting defense was about to fail completely, making moment into crisis, where only immediate intervention through Lee's counterattack arrival could prevent Union breakthrough that would capture Richmond and end Confederacy, requiring perfect timing, where Confederate reinforcements arrived just as desperate defense reached breaking point after holding against overwhelming odds for hours beyond planned duration. Lee arrives and orders largest. Confederate assault of war was climactic moment when delayed reinforcements finally reached battlefield, allowing transition from desperate defense to offensive operations, at last suggesting relief after extended wait, Lee's arrival being desperately anticipated by Hill's embattled defenders, whose defensive line was collapsing. 32,000 Confederates assemble for massive counterattack, representing largest concentrated Confederate force that Lee had gathered for single assault, numerical strength being unprecedented for Southern Army operations. Assemble, meaning concentrate from scattered positions into coordinated attack formation, organizational achievement being remarkable given earlier coordination failures. For massive counterattack whose scale would overwhelm Union forces that had been focused on attacking Hill's small defensive force, tactical surprise combining with numerical concentration for creating devastating offensive. Counterattack meaning transition from defense to offense, Confederate forces exploiting Union exhaustion and extended positions for launching assault that would reverse tactical situation. Lee orders personally directing assault whose timing and coordination required careful management, commanding generals' presence, ensuring proper execution after earlier coordination failures had delayed attack dangerously. Largest Confederate assault, emphasizing unprecedented scale, attacking force being larger than any previous Confederate offensive operation during war's first year. Of war to date, when examining Confederate military operations, assault size demonstrating Lee's commitment of available forces to decisive battle, arrives at critical moment when Hill's defense was collapsing, timing being perfect for exploiting Union exhaustion, while preventing Confederate collapse that appeared imminent, and orders immediate attack rather than waiting for perfect conditions, Lee recognizing that delay would allow Union forces to recover or to retreat, making assault into climactic moment when 32,000 Confederate soldiers assembled for coordinated attack that would transform desperate defensive battle into Confederate offensive victory through striking Union forces whose extended positions and whose exhaustion from hours of attacking Hill's line made them vulnerable to sudden massive counterattack that Lee's delayed reinforcements finally launched after arriving just in time to prevent Confederate defensive collapse and to exploit Union tactical overextension. The charge that engulfs Union Army was massive Confederate assault when 32,000 soldiers attacked exhausted Union forces whose extended positions made them vulnerable to coordinated offensive. As sun sinks, suggesting late afternoon or evening timing, tactical situation being influenced by approaching darkness that would complicate Union defensive responses. Confederate divisions surge forward in coordinated attack, whose scale and timing overwhelmed Union defenders, multiple Confederate units attacking simultaneously, creating pressure that Union forces could not resist effectively. Surge, suggesting powerful momentum. Confederate assault being delivered with force and determination that reflected both numerical strength and tactical advantage of attacking exhausted enemy. Forward toward Union positions whose defenders had been focused on attacking Hill's line and who were not prepared for defending against sudden massive Confederate counterattack. In coordinated fashion, meaning attacks were synchronized rather than piecemeal, tactical coordination being achieved after earlier failures through Lee's personal direction, ensuring proper execution. Attack that smashes Union positions through overwhelming force applied against extended and exhausted defenders, Confederate assault being tactically devastating because Union forces were vulnerable to concentrated attack. Smashes, suggesting violent destruction. Confederate offensive, breaking Union defensive arrangements through sheer force and through exploiting Union tactical weakness. Union positions whose strength had been dissipated through extended offensive operations against Hill, defensive vulnerabilities being created by hours of attacking that left Union units exhausted and poorly positioned. Engulfs, meaning surrounds or overwhelms completely. Confederate assault creating tactical situation where Union forces faced annihilation or retreat as only options when examining how thoroughly Confederate attack dominated battlefield. That Confederate offensive, created through 32,000 soldiers attacking in coordinated assault that exploited Union exhaustion and Union tactical overextension from hours of attacking Hill's line, making charge into devastating offensive, whose timing and scale overwhelmed Union defenders, who had expected to be attacking rather than defending against massive Confederate counterattack, that Lee's finally arrived. Reinforcements launched as sun was setting, transforming defensive battle into Confederate offensive victory through perfectly timed assault against vulnerable enemy. Union soldiers' break under pressure was psychological collapse when exhausted troops facing overwhelming Confederate assault lost will to continue fighting. Exhausted and overwhelmed, describing Union forces' condition after hours of attacking Hill's line followed by sudden massive Confederate counterattack, physical and psychological depletion, making continued resistance impossible. Exhausted from sustained offensive operations against Hill's defense, Union fatigue being critical vulnerability when Confederate counterattack struck troops who lacked energy for effective defense, and overwhelmed by scale and suddenness of Confederate assault, 32,000 attackers, creating pressure that exhausted Union defenders could not resist when surprised by transition from offensive to defensive operations. Union lines collapse, meaning organized defensive resistance dissolved, military formations losing cohesion when soldiers decided that continued fighting was futile. Collapse being psychological rather than merely physical, Union soldiers' belief that battle was lost being self-fulfilling when mass flight prevented effective defense that might have been possible if morale had been maintained. And retreat across river towards safety on opposite bank, where remaining Union forces were positioned, withdrawal being necessary for preventing complete destruction when staying meant capture or death. Across Chickahominy, whose waters provided security from Confederate pursuit, river being natural barrier, protecting retreating Union forces from complete destruction. Break under meaning psychological failure rather than physical destruction, Union soldiers' will to fight being shattered by Confederate assault's shock and scale. Pressure from Confederate attack combining with exhaustion from days' earlier operations, cumulative stress breaking Union morale that had been adequate for offensive operations, but that could not sustain defensive battle against fresh Confederate forces, whose sudden appearance and overwhelming numbers created panic among Union soldiers who had expected victory but who instead faced annihilation, making psychological collapse into tactical disaster, where organized Union resistance dissolved into retreating mass fleeing across river to escape Confederate onslaught. That late-day assault had created through exploiting Union exhaustion and Union tactical overextension. McClellan retreats and Richmond is saved was strategic consequence when Union commander abandoned offensive campaign following Gaines's Mill defeat. McClellan, shaken by defeat, whose unexpected violence and whose tactical reversal contradicted his assumptions about Confederate weakness, psychological impact, making him doubt campaign's viability despite retaining numerical superiority. Shaken, meaning psychologically disturbed rather than physically injured, battle's outcome undermining McClellan's confidence in operational plan and in his army's ability to capture Richmond. By defeat that had transformed apparent Union victory into Confederate success through Lee's counterattack, tactical reversal being shocking for commander who had expected easy victory. Abandons campaign through deciding to withdraw toward James River rather than continuing offensive operations against Richmond, strategic decision representing complete reversal of Union objectives. His campaign, whose purpose was capturing Confederate capital, abandonment meaning Union offensive, had failed despite numerical advantages that should have guaranteed success. And pulls back toward James River where Union naval support could protect army, geographic withdrawal, representing strategic retreat from Richmond whose defenses had proven stronger than McClellan expected. Toward safety that river and navy provided, McClellan prioritizing army's preservation over continuing offensive that Gaines Mill had demonstrated was more dangerous than he had believed. Richmond is saved through McClellan's decision to retreat rather than to continue offensive operations, Confederate capital's preservation being direct result of Gaines's Mill victory, whose tactical success produced strategic consequences. Is saved from capture that had seemed inevitable before Lee's counterattack reversed Union momentum, defensive victory transforming strategic situation from imminent Confederate defeat to Union withdrawal, making McClellan's retreat into war-changing decision, where Union's largest offensive of 1862 was abandoned following single battle, whose outcome convinced Union commander that capturing Richmond was impossible despite overwhelming numerical advantages that should have guaranteed success, demonstrating how tactical victory could produce strategic consequences, exceeding immediate battlefield results through psychological impact that Lee's aggressive counterattack had on cautious Union commander whose retreat saved Richmond and preserved Confederacy at moment when capital's fall appeared imminent. The 3,000 who bought Lee most important hours of war were Hill's defenders, whose desperate stand prevented Union breakthrough during critical period when Lee's reinforcements were delayed. Their suicidal stand, meaning defense against 7-1 odds, numerical disadvantage making defensive mission appear hopeless when examining casualty rates and force ratios, prevented Union breakthrough that would have captured Richmond if Hill's force had collapsed before Lee's counterattack arrived, temporal factor being critical when minutes of additional defense were essential. That would have ended Confederacy in 1862 through capturing capital while destroying defending army, strategic consequences being potentially war-ending when examining how capital's fall would have affected Confederate morale and international recognition. In 1862, when war was young and when Confederate defeat might have prevented prolonged conflict, temporal context emphasizing significance of preventing early Union victory, through preventing immediate collapse that would have allowed Union forces to advance on Richmond unopposed, Hill's defense buying time necessary for Lee's counterattack to arrive. Bought time measured in hours but being strategically priceless, temporal advantage allowing Lee to organize and to launch counterattack that saved Richmond. Lee most important hours, referring to period when Confederate commander needed Hill's defense to hold position. Critical timing, making those hours essential for campaign's outcome. Most important, emphasizing significance, those specific hours being more consequential than any other period during 7 days' battles, when examining how close Union came to decisive victory. Of war, potentially, when examining how Richmond's capture might have ended rebellion early, making Hill's defense arguably most consequential Confederate action of entire conflict, through preventing Union victory that would have captured capital and that would have ended Confederacy before major battles that historians remember, demonstrating how small forces' desperate stand could have strategic consequences, exceeding size through holding at critical moment, when minutes mattered more than numbers, for determining whether capital would fall or would be saved. By Lee's counterattack that Hill's 3,000 men bought time for through impossible defense against overwhelming odds. Gaines's Mill becomes turning point of 7 days' battles, was recognition that victory transformed campaign from Union offensive into Confederate counteroffensive, dominating subsequent operations. Lee's victory propels Confederacy into months of momentum through demonstrating tactical competence and through reversing psychological balance that had favored Union before battle. Propels meaning provides impetus. Gaines's Mill victory, creating confidence and initiative that Confederate forces would maintain through summer 1862, into months following battle when Confederate military operations would be characterized by offensive confidence rather than defensive desperation, psychological transformation being as important as tactical victory. Of momentum meaning sustained period of Confederate success, Gaines' Mill being first major victory in series that would establish Lee's reputation and that would demonstrate Confederate military viability, and changes global perceptions of war through showing European observers that Confederacy could defeat Union armies, international implications being significant when British and French were considering recognition. Changes meaning fundamentally alters Gaines's Mill victory, transforming how foreign governments viewed rebellion's prospects for success. Global perceptions held by European powers whose recognition and support Confederacy desperately sought, military credibility being essential for diplomatic success. Of war's likely outcome, international observers revising estimates about Confederate viability after Lee demonstrated ability to defeat McClellan's superior army. Becomes turning point when examining how battle transformed strategic situation from Union offensive threatening Richmond into Confederate offensive that would carry Lee into Maryland, trajectory shift being dramatic. Of 7 days' battles whose subsequent engagements would be dominated by Confederate initiative that Gaines' Mill victory had established through defeating Union offensive and through forcing McClellan into defensive posture, making battle into pivotal moment, whose consequences extended beyond immediate tactical results, through transforming psychological balance, through establishing Lee's reputation, through affecting international perceptions, and through propelling Confederacy into offensive operations that Gaines' Mill victory had made possible through defeating Union's largest army at moment when Richmond's capture appeared imminent before 3,000. Confederates' impossible stand bought time for Lee's counterattack that saved capital and transformed war's trajectory. The forgotten stand that saved capital was Hill's desperate defense at Gaines's Mill, whose significance historians have overlooked while studying more famous battles. Closes with final truth, acknowledging that every historian remembers Chancellorsville, Antietam, and Gettysburg as major Civil War battles, whose fame overshadows less-known engagements. Remembers famous battles whose names are familiar to students of Civil War history, canonical engagements receiving historical attention while equally significant actions remain obscure, but desperate impossible defense at Gaines' Mill being overlooked despite its strategic significance, historical amnesia making Hill's stand forgotten despite its consequences for Richmond's survival. Is moment Confederacy survived by minutes rather than by decisive margin? Temporal proximity to disaster, emphasizing how close Union came to war-winning victory. By minutes, meaning Hill's defense came within brief period of collapsing before Lee's reinforcements arrived. timing being critical for determining whether Richmond would fall or would be saved. Because 3,000 men held back 21,000 through desperate defense that conventional military wisdom said was impossible, numerical odds being overcome through determination, terrain, and fortification. Held back meaning prevented from advancing, small Confederate force stopping much larger Union force through defensive effectiveness that statistics suggested was impossible. Long enough for Lee to strike with counterattack that saved Richmond, temporal factor being essential when Hill's defense bought hours necessary for Confederate reinforcements to arrive and to attack. That saved capital through preventing Union breakthrough that would have captured Richmond if Hill's line had collapsed earlier. Causal chain making Hill's defense essential for capital's preservation and for Confederacy's survival in 1862. Forgotten stand whose historical obscurity contradicts its strategic significance. Hill's defense being overlooked while more famous battles receive attention despite Gaines' Mill being moment when 3,000 Confederates held impossible position against 7-1 odds for buying time that allowed Lee's counterattack to save Richmond at moment when capital's fall appeared minutes away, making forgotten defense into arguably most consequential action of entire war through preventing Union victory that would have ended rebellion. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.